Hey, Mike, I've had an amazing week. My cat, Kitty Perry, cancer is cured. My hair's grown back. I put on 10 pounds of muscle this week. I've lost fat. I've gotten at least 20 points on my IQ. 3 letters, CBD, oil.
Well, that's amazing. I've had similar experiences. I was actually going blind. On Monday, and then on Tuesday, after I took some CBD, I got my vision back.
2010.
And then on Wednesday, 48 hours after taking the CBD, my ear hair grew and my eyebrows reduced in size.
Yeah. So, as you probably picked up, Mike and I are pretty frustrated with all the claims right now around CBD oil. So we decided we've had enough, and we're going to give you the straight dope on CBD.
Hey there, I'm Mike.
And I'm Matt.
And I'm Jody. The Wild Health Podcast is our quest into human performance, longevity, and personalized medicine. Together, along with experts in these fields, we'll learn how to live longer, better, and become smarter and stronger. We'll do the deep dive into the research and hard work of putting it all together, and you reap the benefits.
So before we get to the straight dope, I do want to mention some experiences that I have actually had with CBD. So just a few days ago, actually, I was flying to Kentucky to meet Matt for some stuff, and I decided to take some CBD before I got on the plane. And I notoriously hate flying. I can't stand it. It's a lot of hurry up and wait. There's all this anxiety associated with security and trying to get through the airport, and then you add in all the turbulence and like the sweaty palms that you get from. I really can't stand flying. So I took 20 milligrams of CBD oil about 2 hours before I got on the plane. And I got to tell you, man, I had a totally different experience on the plane. I felt completely unstoppable in the security line. You couldn't ride during the turbulence, and there was some pretty moderate turbulence. And I ended up having a really pretty good day, despite what would normally be like a very anxiety-provoking, stressful day. And I managed to get a bunch of work done at the same time. Like, not only was I less anxious, but on the plane, I was just crushing it. I mean, I killed at least like 30 articles, primary research on CBD. I mean, it really feels like there's something very unique happening when I take this drug. And I don't want to come off as a zealot, but at the same time, like...
Great story, Mike, and useless story, because that's not science. I think we should be honest that both of us take CBD, and we take it for different reasons. I wear an Oura ring. I do an N of 1 study every night. I've tried different dosages based on the literature just to see how it affects my REM and deep sleep. And it definitely has an effect. But it drives me crazy that nearly every patient I have, every person that I talk to, I get texts all the time about CBD oil, thinking it's this magical molecule. And I think we both agree there's something there, like you said, but we need to be clear about the science, and we need to not overstate claims. And that's what we want to do today. Really dig into that science, talk about what it is, talk about what has been proven, and be very clear about what it can't do, or what at least not been proven to do yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to come off as a zealot here. I mean, I've actually taken CBD for other things. Like, I tried it after my shoulder surgery and found absolutely no benefit. Yeah, I couldn't even tell I was using it. It didn't change my pain whatsoever. So let's come at this from a scientific perspective. And in order to do that, I've kind of obsessed over some of the primary research here, backing CBD or looking at CBD, and I've learned a lot about it. And I feel fairly well educated at this point, but I think it'd probably be best if we brought someone in who's, devoted their career to it.
Yeah. And as you and I have started to read this primary research, what we've realized is we can't cover this in one podcast. Like, there's so much interesting stuff there. So we're going to have a multi-part podcast where we'll dive into that. But today, let's just talk about what it is, what we know it does, what we know it doesn't do, or what hasn't been proven yet. So that expert that we want to bring in today is Taylor. Taylor has a degree in molecular biology from Princeton, a PhD in genomics from UC San Diego, and he is a true expert in the field. So I met Taylor at his lab where he's actually producing and processing CBD. Because like I mentioned before, like Mike and I take it, and I've been pretty worried about the purity and the quality and what's in it. And I've actually been on farms. I've met farmers who are growing it. I've met Taylor and how he's producing it and processing it. And I was really excited to hear his story, and he knows his stuff. So So, Taylor, thanks so much for coming on and joining us.
Not a problem, guys. Appreciate you having me here.
All right. So, Taylor, thanks so much for coming on and joining us. So, Taylor, thanks so much for coming on and joining us. So, Taylor, thanks so much for coming on and joining us.
Taylor, I thought it might be cool for us to kind of come at this first and talk about the pharmacology behind CBD, kind of where it comes from, how it works potentially in the body, before we get into some of the more ludicrous claims that people have there regarding CBD. So I thought maybe what we could do is I'm going to try to describe how CBD works, where it comes from, and you can interrupt and tell me where I'm wrong. Does that sound like a decent way to go about it?
Yeah, sounds like a good place to start.
Okay, cool. We keep saying CBD. CBD is cannabidiol.
Correct, cannabidiol.
You got a thumbs up.
One of many cannabinoids, all with all with the same sounding name, really. So.
Right, which is super confusing. And I'm going to try not to say all of the other ones because nobody would be able to understand the difference. It's like cannabinol and cannabidiol. And I mean, so basically there's CBD and there's a bunch of other cannabinoids. And then there's THC, right, which I think we all are familiar with from the marijuana plant. These are all different chemicals, but they're all coming from the cannabis plant, is my understanding. And cannabidiol is extracted from the cannabis plant at a rate of anywhere from like 0 to 40% of the dry weight of the plant, depending specifically on the plant genetics. You can get CBD into your body by either eating it, smoking it, or rubbing it on you, or technically shoving it up your butt, but I'm not really going to go into that today. And you absorb about twice as much if you inhale it versus ingest it through your mouth, which we can talk about a little bit later when we talk about actual dosing. So people have been taking CBD for thousands of years, basically as long as they've been smoking weed or hash oil. And it's only the last few decades that we've really been studying it in terms of scientific research in medical space.
So yeah, I mean that's all generally correct here. I mean, with the cannabis plant, human beings have been either ingesting or smoking the cannabis plant for thousands of years for various medicinal qualities that they've thought to it. The one thing that I think is really important to kind of lay out at the beginning here is that we talk about CBD or maybe even CBC or THC itself. None of these molecules actually exist in the cannabis plant. All of these molecules in a different form, known as the acid form, are present in the cannabis plant. And these acid forms actually have an additional chemical unit on them known as our carboxylic acid group. And why this is important to understand is these acid forms of these cannabinoids are not actually bioavailable. And the way that we make them bioavailable to get these effects that we're seeing is that we heat them. And this is why we smoke cannabis or use heat in other ways to decarboxylate, making these forms actually bioavailable. So the kind of the way that most people have interacted with this is if back in the day you ever decided to eat half a pound of marijuana rather than smoke it, you really had no other effect other than just a bad stomach ache. And so the interesting part here is that all these molecules we talk about only exist kind of post-processing from this cannabis plant extraction.
Okay, so that makes sense. So that's basically why we've always thought of cannabis in terms of cooking. Like people are cooking it like making brownies or something like that. They're getting the heat from the cooking as opposed from the smoking.
Exactly.
Cool. So let's talk a little bit about how CBD could potentially act in the body. And this is going to get a little complicated here. I don't want to sugarcoat it. There's a lot of different actions of CBD in the body, at least 15 different specifically. And we're not going to talk about all of them here, but I do want to talk about a few of them. So to start off, let's talk about something called the endocannabinoid system. So the endocannabinoid system is something that we just recently realized even exists. And it's this combination of receptors, CB1 and CB2. These are found in two different places specifically, one in neurons in the CNS, and that's predominantly the CB1 receptor, as well as on immune cells, and that's predominantly the CB2 receptor. Now, your body makes some chemicals that actually act on these receptors. That's called AEA and 2AG, but also THC and CBD have some activity on these receptors. Specifically, THC activates the receptors, and CBD, for the most part, as far as we can tell, is an antagonist of these receptors, meaning that it kind of has like a negative effect on that receptor. And THC and CBD to some degree kind of compete to attach to this receptor. So the best way I can think to describe this without getting super technical is that these receptors kind of control the way that neurons fire. So if you're going to activate these receptors, to make a long story short, you're going to reduce the amount of neurotransmitters released by your neurons. So your neurons are going to release less GABA and less glutamate, which are neurotransmitters, and sort of activate the next neuron next to it less often. Is that a decent way to describe it, Taylor? Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense overall, and it is a good intro into the myriad of ways the endocannabinoid system impacts human physiology, many of which we're still trying to understand. And honestly, new ways are being discovered as more research in this area, due to the change in federal regulations in the U.S. around research, is kind of allowing us to fully explore this very unique system. So one thing I wanted to mention about the endocannabinoid system, it's one of the few systems in the human body that was very much discovered because of its exogenous, or its impact towards exogenous factors. So the endocannabinoid system was first found as a response to cannabinoids in the late 80s, early 90s. And at the time, we didn't know any endogenous function for that particular system. It was only 3 or 4 years later when they actually found the endocannabinoids, anandamide or AEA, as you mentioned, and 2-AG. And so that's really been the impetus for kind of study into the system. Before, they just kind of thought it was more of a quote unquote drug oriented system. So lots of research in this area has kind of been moving forward, and we found the endocannabinoid system being involved in all sorts of processes, from fertility and development to appetite, pain, and mood, to even memory formation. And both CB1 and CB2 are known to work in many different ways. Some in conjunction with each other, some in conjunction with other receptors. And so it's a very complex system that we're just kind of starting to learn more about.
Can we talk a little bit about specifically how CBD and THC act on the CB1 receptor? Because I think it's a little bit confusing to me, because I sort of always thought of CBD as just kind of being the same as THC minus the psychoactive effect. But it sounds like they actually have opposing effects at the CB1 receptor, yet at the same time still sort of the same effects in the long run, if that makes sense.
I think it's also confusing because we're talking about them having opposite effects potentially, but we also hear people talk about the entourage effect where they work together, and they are frequently used for similar things like anxiety, for example. They may have positive effects on both. So can you clarify that, Taylor?
So I can certainly start to clarify. I think more research needs to be done, but getting back to what you mentioned, Matt, the entourage effect. So the entourage effect is this idea that a combination, kind of a very nondescript combination of cannabinoids and other substances extracted from the cannabis plant work in conjunction to have what we would consider positive effects. And so one of the more interesting effects here we see is that CBD will actually compete with THC and limit THC's ability to have that kind of psychoactive effect. And so here you see them competing with each other in this one aspect, the psychoactive effect. At the same time, they are working on other receptors throughout the body, not only CB1 and CB2, but other what are called G protein coupled receptors, to have some of these more palliative effects, such as increase in appetite or decrease in anxiety. So what we've seen in the literature and kind of on the internet is that people kind of break both these molecules down into it does this or it does that, or they have this function specifically at this moment. And it's much more complex than that. It's an interaction between many of these different molecules, different parts of the body, and at different concentrations depending on how let's say you administer to yourself. So there's all sorts of things here. And again, we're still just learning as we go, but it's definitely more complex than this is its only effect at this moment.
Let's talk a little bit about that. So I think there's two specific actions of CBD that we can talk about that may help clarify this for people. So one is CBD seems to decrease the psychoactive break, or the psychotic break that we commonly see from THC. And one of the ways that we think that's possible is that it actually acts as an agonist at the serotonin receptor, 5-H.
But you're not talking about actually psychotic break. You're talking about just the psychoactive effect right now. The only reason I clarify that is because people do talk about schizophrenics having a psychotic break while taking.
No, I'm talking specifically about the psychotic break, and CBD is actually being researched, as my understanding, against psychosis. So, also in addition to the psychotic break, I think that there are people that claim that there is less psychosis associated with CBD. If you take, for example, if you took like marijuana that had a higher concentration of CBD than another one, you would see less of the psychotic effect. But I'm specifically talking about psychotic breaks seen in schizophrenics who are using THC, and we've seen a decrease in those, is my understanding, due to activation of the 5-HT1A receptor, which is a serotonin receptor, which is probably the same receptor that we're seeing the antidepressant, the anxiolytic effects from CBD, is my understanding. So my point being that CBD is not just acting at these endocannabinoid receptors; it's also acting at things like serotonin receptors to have some of these anti-anxiety, potentially neuroprotective and antidepressant effects. While at the same time, the other thing that CBD appears to do is slow the breakdown of that endogenous chemical, those endogenous chemicals that activate the CB1 receptors. So it may be that some of the sort of entourage effect that we're seeing is because that in addition to THC activating the CB1s, CBD is decreasing the amount of the endogenous chemicals that activate the CB1 as well. So you're seeing a little bit of both. So it's also the THC plus the 2AG or the AEA activating the CB1 receptors. Did I totally lose you?
So was that a question or a statement?
No. I mean, so what Mike's getting into is kind of delving into the complexity of CBD, because while it's called the endocannabinoid system, again, remember, evolution created the system not to respond to cannabinoids from the cannabis plant. It was created to work with anandamide and 2AG to have some of these more neurological and immune-based functions. So the CBD does impact CB1 and CB2, and those were the receptors that were first found to bind it. But it does have effects for many other receptors, again, in this G protein coupled receptor family. We also see CBD can modulate opioid receptors. And there are starting to be more and more anecdotal evidence, along with actual studies, showing that CBD and other cannabinoids can have benefits for those with opioid addiction or working through opioid, long-term opioid use. And again, this is because CBD and the other cannabinoids are fairly promiscuous in their ability to impact these receptors, and the more we get into it here, and the more research we do, the more complex it gets.
And the more claims we see, because we see that CBD is acting in so many places. I mean, 15 different receptor activities, that are all independent of one another. Of course, there's going to be tons of different potential claims as to what CBD could be doing in your body.
Correct. And one of the things we see a lot of these claims is they devolve into single indication claims. CBD is good for this. THC is good for that. And a lot of that either comes from overinterpretation of the data, or looking at cell culture or animal studies that are kind of very specifically targeted to what a particular indication is looking for. And so we lose that complexity. And if we're really going to get into CBD long term, we need to really embrace the complexity of this signaling system.
Right, because people talk about treating anxiety, depression, psychosis, epilepsy, autism, any type of inflammation. And the problem, though, is that a lot of these preclinical studies on the mechanism of action or the potential mechanisms of action just talk about that, but they don't really create clear indications for CBD itself for specific disease processes for the most part.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think one of the main reasons I wanted to talk about the activity of CBD and all the different ways that it could potentially act in the body is just because I want people to understand how complex it is. This is not a black and white issue. This is definitely multiple shades of gray, in the sense that we don't truly understand exactly how it's working. we see a lot of different effects, and even the clinical trials, we're seeing a lot of different effects, and a lot of them we don't really understand the exact specific mechanism by which CBD is working. So I think that's important for everybody to recognize, and hopefully that knowledge will help us understand why there could be so many claims out there that are potentially unfounded, and some of which may have something behind them. We just don't understand how it works. So before we jump into that, though, I want to get us to some of the claims of CBD and some of the potential uses. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about some more of the pharmacology. So Taylor, could you tell us a little bit about the pharmacokinetics of CBD in terms of how it's metabolized in the body, how long it lasts in our system?
So the pharmacokinetics of CBD are actually fairly well understood, especially for a molecule that is administered in so many different ways. So the way that we can receive CBD into the body is through inhalation, suppository, sublingually, i.e. under the tongue, and then ingestion or absorption through the GI. And of those, inhalation is the most efficient, about 3 to 4 times as efficient as the other methods. And so far, the best mix of ease of use and absorption looks to be sublingual at the moment. This is kind of taking the CBD oil-based products, placing them under the tongue for about 30 seconds, and then swallowing. Although this is changing a little bit, new vape products are kind of coming out that have CBD and are kind of readily easy to take, readily absorbed to the body, and don't have a lot of the other baggage that comes along with smoking cannabis, whether it be THC focused or CBD focused.
Quick question about that, sure, though, Taylor. So I know under your tongue for 30 seconds, you absorb a lot sublingually and then you swallow. How much are you getting from after and what you swallow just through your digestive tract? Like what percentage do you think of the CBD is absorbed sublingually versus later?
So the answer to that question is that of the CBD that you take in, sublingually, it's about 6 to 10% available. And then through the gut, you're going to see about 1 to 2%. So of your question, taking those numbers out, you'll get roughly about 5 to 6 times more sublingually than you would just through the gut.
Then what about, can you just hold
tincture? Yeah, that's my question. When you use the tincture, can you just put it under your tongue and just leave it there for a couple of minutes then?
Yeah, if you leave it there longer, are you getting more, or is it maximally absorbed really after 30 seconds?
So yeah, ideally you can leave it there for 1 to 2 minutes. Usually, just because of people being people, they'll swallow it kind of just naturally after about a minute. I mean, you can really focus and do it, but you'll achieve most of the absorption you're going to look for in that first 1 to 2 minutes. It'll be a log decay curve in terms of absorbing it. You'll absorb a lot in the beginning, and then as the concentration drops under your tongue, it'll be less over time.
And a log decay curve means that it's not a linear relationship, is what you're saying, basically. Like you
Correct.
get the majority of it at the beginning and then you get less. And I fell down a rabbit hole just yesterday, and I was looking at this dog study where they had dogs taking different doses of CBD. And it was interesting that the higher the dose, the longer the absorption took, basically. So like you would see that drop off much quicker with a lower dose than with a higher dose. There was like this slower drop off. So it was a more linear relationship, which I thought was interesting.
When it's an important point, and the reason why I ask is because it's not a cheap thing. It's not inexpensive. And so I think it's kind of lazy if you just leave it under your tongue for 30 seconds, if you're going to get a big difference at 1 to 2 minutes for something that you're paying good money for. So that's the reason I ask. I think a lot of people wonder that.
Well, especially you have a lot of people who, I talk to them like, I just take a squirt in the morning and a squirt at night. And, that you can certainly do it that way. But as Matt's noting, you're kind of just swallowing a lot of money at that point. So sublingually is definitely going to be the most effective way to take that oil. And so definitely focus on what you're doing and keep it on your tongue for as long as you can.
And a bigger dose, like Mike was noting, if you're taking a bigger dose, you definitely need to leave it under there longer, probably.
Yep.
To really get the absorption.
Correct.
And you said what's the half-life?
The half-life looks to be, if you look at multiple studies, the half-life looks to be roughly about 24 hours. You will see CBD after a single administration in the blood for 5 to 6 days. And that's just in plasma levels. Some of the highly pure IV administration routes that you see with some of the clinical trials that have been done, which I'm sure we'll get into here in a minute, have much quicker half-lives. But in general, for these kind of normal administration routes, that being either a vape or a sublingual administration or GI, it looks to be about 24 hours. And the reason GI is the least efficient of all these mechanisms is because CBD is metabolized in the liver using pretty canonical processes. So this is your CYP450 oxidases, as well as some other phase two kind of transmission situations where you're putting on chemical units that help the body flush this out. So there are known metabolites, but they're not known to be too effective. So you're really looking at that CBD molecule being ingested and then getting in the bloodstream as long as it can before it gets metabolized in the liver.
Well, and the half-life is important, but not as important, I think, as the kind of peak plasma maximal effect time. Because if someone's taking it for anxiety or sleep or something like that, when is this going to start working? How quickly does it start working?
So, well, depending on what you're trying to use it for, and then obviously your mileage will vary. But in discussions with people, especially who use it kind of on a more fast acting, in a fast acting attempt for, let's say, an anxiety or whatnot, you look to get that kind of that Cmax in the plasma relatively quickly from a sublingual administration. So, let's say in the kind of 30 minutes, and then in a vape type situation where you're actually inhaling it, that maximum CBD in the plasma, that Cmax, that is a technical pharmacokinetic term. You can see that anywhere in the kind of 5 to 10 minute range.
You said it's metabolized by the liver. Is that right?
It's metabolized in the liver predominantly.
Gotcha.
It can also be shunted from the plasma into tissues. You see this more with THC. This is why people who will smoke marijuana will be able to test positive for weeks afterwards, because it'll be deposited in the tissue and then it'll leak back out into the plasma. And our detection limits are quite good these days on the analytics side. So it can be pushed out into the tissue where it can be metabolized, but the major metabolism center of many of the cannabinoids is in the liver using kind of canonical breakdown processes. And
Taylor, what's our average dose here? I mean, I don't think that we've really even said like what a normal dose is for someone of CBD. Is it 10, 20 milligrams? Is it 20 milligrams per kilogram? I know there's a lot of variability in the actual research, but just in terms of your understanding as to what typically people take on a recreational basis.
So on a recreational basis, most people take in the kind of 3/4 to 1 milligram per kilogram per day. And this is kind of what, I would say is what you're seeing and kind of recommended for kind of this supplemental CBD, administration process. In contrast, if you look at CBD when it's used in clinical situations, in those indications that are approved by the FDA, they start at a 2.5 milligrams per kilogram twice a day kind of administration. And so that is a clinical dose for a clinical indication. When we're looking at more of a supplemental indication.
And I think the word supplemental is much better than when we said recreational. I don't want to give people the wrong idea. There's no psychoactive component here. So yeah, supplemental is a great way to describe that. So,
I mean, a good place to kind of, you start with that FDA level and, we always cut it in half. So I would not recommend anyone take more than basically 1 1/3 milligrams per kilogram. So that's about 100 milligrams per day for an average human, without discussions with a physician.
And just to give you some context there. So for the studies that are using that for epilepsy, they're taking upwards of 20 milligrams per kilogram, which would, be like 1,400 milligrams in a day for a normal sized human being.
Yeah, and you see bottles of 500 milligrams per 30 ml. So it's like drinking 3 bottles or having 3 bottles. So that's a big dose compared to what most people are taking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's about 15 to 20 times, I think, what anyone would take kind of from a supplemental relationship. And, it's just for the types of indications or the reasons people are taking these CBD supplements, you just don't need that much. And then honestly, you look at some of the studies that are done, especially in animals and cell culture, they're also up in the hundreds of milligrams a day. And so this is why when we get into these studies, you always want to kind of evaluate them skeptically, because these are doses that you would not see kind of on a day-to-day basis in humans.
Yeah, and you
also
mentioned
couldn't afford.
Yeah, correct.
And you mentioned FDA dosing, so that's why we brought up the Epidiolex, because it's FDA approved for Dravet syndrome. So just to summarize, though, so CBD, it's a cannabinoid found in the cannabis plant in varying concentrations. You can smoke it, ingest it orally. It acts on multiple receptors, including CB1 and CB2, and about 15 different other pathways, leaving us with a whole host of potential uses.
Yeah, and the uses is kind of where things get a little bit tricky, and I think part of the problem here is that CBD is complicated. The pharmacology is complicated. It's got a potential to act at a lot of different systems, and it's got this relationship with THC. So I think it's kind of coming with a lot of baggage, meaning people seem to overblow its claims, and others tend to completely blow it off entirely because it's related to THC or it doesn't have the appropriate amount of research backing some of the claims. But let's first remember that cannabinol as the molecule through Epidiolex is approved by the FDA. And that doesn't mean that it's entirely safe, because plenty of drugs that have been approved by the FDA have proved to not be safe, but it does mean that there's a decent amount of research backing its safety. It's probably not going to turn you green or turn you into a frog overnight. But at the same time, it's important to remember that that's a specific drug that's been made, that's been tested by the FDA. So in some ways, it is important, where is the drug coming from? Farmer Joe who's hand squeezing his hemp seed oil down the street is probably not the same chemical that you're getting if you bought it in a pharmacy, right? So I think it's just important to remember that that there is FDA backing of a similar chemical to what we're talking about, and that it has found to be pretty safe.
Yeah, but what people are buying in the store is not the FDA approved version. The FDA approved version is very specific. And I mean, it is the same molecule, but what they're buying at the store is potentially that molecule, which could have other things in it. So I think what you're bringing that up just because whenever you're trying to decide whether to take a supplement or a medication, you always need to be talking about the risk and benefit of it. So what are the risks? I mean, if we want to talk about the risk benefit equation.
Yeah. So, if we're going to talk about the risk benefit equation, it's important to know what your risks are before you take any medication or any supplement prior, for whatever reason.
And I guess before we say what are the risks, I mean, clearly if it's tainted with paint thinner, which I've talked to Taylor about, some people have actually used paint thinner as an extraction method just because it's so unregulated, or it's got something else that's cut in it, like supplement companies would do just so that you feel an effect and feel like you're getting something really strong. That's a very clear risk with this supplement. But the actual molecule itself, what kind of side effects have you seen in looking through research on that, Mike?
Well, the best data that we have is the randomized controlled trials that were done for Epidiolex, which was, as we mentioned, an extremely high dose, like 10 to 20 milligrams per kilogram per day. But at least we've got pretty good data to suggest what we should expect as side effects. And in those studies, there was one in like 360 patients. They found that 25% of people had diarrhea, 23% had somnolence, 21% had some convulsions, which may have been related to their seizures. And then about 10% people had elevated LFTs or liver function tests. Another study in children, mostly with epilepsy, about 250 patients, also saw about 35% diarrhea, 25% decreased appetite, and like 10 to 20% LFT elevations. So
there was some fever. There was some fever in that study too, right? The pyrexia.
Yeah, I think you're right. 25% or so had some fevers. So important to remember, these are whopping doses. I mean, like we mentioned, 20 milligrams per kilogram are super high. But I think it's nice to know that in these particular studies, those side effects were only enough to make people stop taking the medication in about 2 to 4% of the total number of people that were taking the meds. So mostly tolerable, I guess, is what I'm getting at. With the caveat being, if you're taking high doses, you probably need to follow liver function tests.
Yeah, so 20 milligrams per kilogram. Remember, it's 3 of those 500 milligram bottles. That's a big dose. Do you remember, Mike, when looking at if there was certain carrier oils or things too? Because when you talk about diarrhea and stuff like that, I mean, taking that big of a dose of those actual like bottles you buy at the store, that's quite a bit of MCT oil or coconut oil or hemp seed oil or whatever else they put in. Do you know what they had that in?
Off the top of my head, it was whatever Epidiolex comes in. I'm not, because that's specifically what those studies were looking at. I'm not sure what the carrier is on that.
Yeah, so the point that Matt's making is if you take 60 to 90 milliliters of MCT oil a day, and you are not you are not used to it, you will have problems.
You will crap your pants.
So so just in general, though, I mean, the point here is that as a molecule, CBD, even at high doses, has a good safety profile. That's going to be your technical drug development terminology. If you look at enough clinical trials, you see that these percentages that you're seeing here for things like diarrhea, LFTs, you see a lot of these percentages. So you see a lot of these same things in many different trials, because again, remember, a clinical trial is being used in a population that has a clinical indication, and they're taking a dose of a molecule to specifically address that clinical indication. And so their risk benefit different, equation is always going to be a little different. But in general, CBD as a pure molecule, which is really the key. I mean, I can't overemphasize enough that you're not, a lot of times in the supplement-based CBD that you're taking, you have to really be sure that you know where you're getting it from, to know that what else is in there besides that CBD molecule. This is
true for all supplements, right? I mean, like anytime you say the word supplement, you basically say, not regulated. It's really, we should just change the word supplement to be not regulated, right? I mean,
and so, I mean, this CBD comes from plant extracts, and you got to think, if not done correctly, you could be extracted with super harsh solvents. It could be full of pesticides, could be all sorts of stuff. So you do want to make sure you know where you're getting your supplements from, and that the companies you're working with are above board at all levels.
And that's how I met Taylor. I was very concerned about something I'm putting in my body, and I actually know the people who are making it. But let's talk specifically about some of the data that's out there and some of the indications that people are talking about using this for, because I really want to get into some of these outlandish claims, because on the one hand, no, it is not the devil because it's in the cannabis plant. It's not. We all agree it has a lot of potential. But on the other hand, people need to chill out. Like, it doesn't cure everything. So let's talk about some of the things that people are taking it for.
In my opinion, the most outlandish claim that we see kind of floating around about CBD is CBD's relation to cancer, specifically that it can, quote unquote, cure cancer. And when you see this often, it's not necessarily a specific cancer. It's just CBD, or maybe other cannabinoids, THC and whatnot, are portrayed as this panacea for all cancers. And a lot of times that you'll come across these headlines and kind of what I call press release medicine. And they'll take what are, quality research studies, but these studies are early preclinical research being done by reputable labs, reputable institutions. But when they find something that CBD perhaps inhibits a particular cancer pathway, or could be used in X, Y, and Z in a small rodent study, these are all the beginning of the work that's needed to do to move CBD forward as a potential anti-cancer agent, but they in no way are indicative of curing cancer, and they're certainly not indicative of you should forego all other research because big medicine is hiding this secret from you. And so, to me, I think that's kind of where currently our most outlandish claim is, and honestly, you see it more often than not.
I love that description of press release medicine. And it's so true, right? Because I mean, if you look at some of the titles of these articles, and which, I mean, they're reasonably titled, but they could be taken and just extracted as a one-off and assumed that all of a sudden this drug is like the cure. For example, like some of the titles that I've written down here: reduced angiogenesis in tumor cells, inhibiting cancer cell invasion, reduced tumor viability and invasiveness in neuroblastoma, reduced invasiveness of glioblastoma cells. And the problem is, on the end of each one of those statements, you have to put the words "in culture," meaning it happened in a petri dish, not in a human being.
Yeah, I mean, and we cure cancer in a cell culture dish every day. I've done it myself constant number of times. And it is the first step, right? If it doesn't work in a cell culture dish, it doesn't move on in the pipeline of preclinical research. So it is the first step. And as you noted, all those titles are completely reasonable, but you have to finish the entire title.
I think a really nice pointer for people, if you are looking at primary research and trying to figure out what the validity of some of these claims are, which you can do yourself. This is doable. And if you go onto PubMed.com and look up some of this primary research, if you click the box in the top left corner that says clinical trial, then you basically exclude all the trials that weren't done in humans in clinical medicine. So you exclude all those cell culture trials. You exclude all those mouse and rat studies. And that could be a really meaningful difference. And it really decreases the number of actual studies that you get when you put in a search term. I did find one study that was done, but hasn't been published yet. And it was a clinical study looking at cancer, and it was Epidiolex. They looked at 21 patients with GBM and found an increase in 1-year survival and length of survival in those patients. But it hasn't actually been published in the literature yet. It's only been released by the company that makes that drug, and sort of like a pre-release state. So I guess what we're getting at is there could potentially be something here, and a lot of the primary research is suggesting that. But there is definitely absolutely nothing that says that you're going to cure your cancer using CBD.
No, the data is interesting, but we have to be honest. And I'm all about giving people hope, but the data is not there to recommend regular use of CBD in cancer therapy. We definitely need to be doing the research because there's a hint of something there, but it's just not there yet. And the mechanisms are intriguing. And that early clinical trial that you mentioned, that sounds promising, but it sounds like mechanisms of things like reduced angiogenesis and inhibition of tumor cell invasion could potentially apply to other cancers, but just the blind application of those could also be dangerous. There was one study recently found that CBD combined with DNA damaging agents could kill human and mouse glioblastoma cells in culture, but the same dosing caused CNS toxicity and death of neuroprogenitor cells. So that's the kind of thing that you're not typically going to see and be able to tease out in cell culture studies. And it just requires more advanced research and the exact reason why it's important to really go through the entire rigorous scientific process when you're talking about applying something to humans with a disease like cancer.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the main issue with how CBD and cancer is currently portrayed, specifically on the internet, where the studies that we've been talking about, in cell culture or animal models are taken out of the context that, Matt and Mike, you just put those studies into. And I feel this is kind of, really destructive. Like a cancer diagnosis is much more than a medical issue, right? There's existential concerns, individuals and their close families and friends are very vulnerable immediately after a cancer diagnosis. And then to go on the internet and see the sites claiming that CBD will fix your cancer. And, this is, your doctor's not telling you about this magical cure, is a travesty. And it's the type of stuff that has up to this point limited, kind of more, above board or relevant or, just more appropriate research on CBD and how it can actually be used in some of these more complex indications such as cancer. And so, I find this aggressively offensive, really. I mean, to take a molecule that has such a good shot at maybe doing some good and have it kind of be pushed aside because of all this other kind of press release medicine that we've been talking about. And so hopefully kind of more work like we're doing here today and kind of going through the context and helping educate, people out there will really kind of be a light amongst the darkness here, what we're seeing on CBD and cancer.
So Taylor, what else other than cancer? Are there other disease processes that you feel like we should highlight?
So another one that you see a lot is CBD and its effects on dementia, usually revolving around Alzheimer's disease. And so here the situation is a bit more complex than cancer because we not only see the same oversimplification of early research studies that we've been talking about that is so pernicious with CBD and cancer, but this is also coupled with anecdotal evidence from caregivers where they see the actual benefits of CBD, which is kind of the anti-anxiety, calming effects. And I know we'll probably get into those later, perhaps in another podcast. They see these effects of CBD as improvements in dementia, whereas maybe you have less agitation in particular a patient with dementia. And so you see this as an improvement. So this kind of makes it a little harder to tease out when kind of people are out there searching on the internet or looking for information on CBD. For instance, Dementia Care Central claims that a study from the Salk Institute in San Diego found evidence that CBD or other cannabinoids would, quote unquote, help remove dementia from brain cells. So first of all, that's not a thing. You don't remove dementia from brain cells.
I love that statement, remove dementia from brain cells.
I wish there was a way we could remove dementia from brain cells. That'd be easy, But not only does that not really mean anything, but when you actually go to the study that was published by the Salk, which is a well-renowned research institute, they did show that there was a reduction in protein aggregates and amyloid beta in cell culture, right? So again, good, positive, early preclinical data, but in no way are we removing dementia from cells, and especially not doing it in humans, right? But again, I do want to take a second to highlight some groups are doing it the right way. So the Alzheimer's Society of Great Britain, you look at their website and their publications, they currently state the case for CBD very clearly, noting that it does not stop, reverse, or prevent dementia, but that CBD can help manage symptoms such as agitation and aggression. So, this just, again, reiterates when you're out there looking, especially on the internet of all places, for information on either clinical indications or supplements, you always have to be paying attention to who is feeding you the information and always read past the headline.
Yeah. We're totally in a clickbait culture. So it's kind of a low hanging fruit to attack because of the whole recreational marijuana being legalized. So it's kind of just an easy target. And that, like you say, that's putting it in the dark instead of shining the light on it for sure.
Yeah, and they talk about things that people are really scared of, and if you play on people's fear, then you can really sell a lot of product. But that is one that I am really interested in with dementia. I mean, we may not be able to suck the dementia right out of the brain cells, but I'm really interested in the potential. I mean, you talk about it being them doing it right and saying it can reduce symptoms of agitation and aggression. And honestly, this is a physiological process, a biological process. But what is Alzheimer's really? It is the symptom constellation. So if we can improve it, that is doing something. And we have seen kind of a hint that CBD may induce hippocampal neurogenesis. There's some studies of cells in culture showing that CBD and THC. You mentioned amyloid, but I've also seen some talking about tau tangles as well. But unlike something like the regrow protocol that's been applied to people and has some real evidence in people, there aren't any real clinical trials suggesting the efficacy of CBD and dementia can really reverse it and do some of the things I think people hope and believe it can do. And I'm honestly very interested in actively changing that. I would love to. We're kind of exploring right now doing some clinical trials where we combine maybe CBD with some things that could be helpful for the symptoms too, like pure CA caprylic acid or just a lot of the supplements and things that are in the RECO protocol. So maybe we'll get more evidence in the future, but this is not going to suck the dementia out of your brain cells right now. We can't say that it does that.
Another one I thought we should maybe talk about is inflammatory bowel disease. I think a lot of people hear that CBD has this anti-inflammatory property, and that often gets extrapolated into all inflammatory disease. And unfortunately, the problem is that most disease is inflammatory. And the truth is there isn't any good data to suggest that CBD is going to cure your Crohn's or your ulcerative colitis or your inflammatory bowel disease. In fact, there was actually a randomized controlled trial in 2017 that showed no benefit of CBD versus placebo in Crohn's disease, and another one in ulcerative colitis was performed using high doses of CBD, and again found no change in remission or even CRP levels. They actually looked at high sensitivity CRP levels in these patients with UC and found no change between the CBD and the placebo arms. And to top that off, there's been two 2018 Cochrane reviews for both Crohn's and UC showing no conclusive benefit. So small studies, but definitely nothing to suggest that taking CBD is going to cure your ulcerative colitis or your Crohn's.
Yeah, I mean, I admit that I was disappointed by those, the outcome of those clinical trials. I mean, I think I had great hopes for what CBD could do on an anti-inflammatory basis for both Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, but the data is the data. I mean, at this point, all we can say is that, human clinical trial data, randomized controlled trials, which is the gold standard, doesn't support the use of CBD for specifically treating your inflammatory bowel disease or Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. Now, I guess for all of these indications we've been talking about, that doesn't preclude someone from taking CBD as a supplement to get some of the benefits that it does indeed have. For instance, increasing appetite in cancer patients or reducing agitation or having a calming effect in individuals who may be suffering from dementia.
The difference between curing a disease and making the symptoms better is an important one to bring up, which I think is what you're kind of getting at. And I think, for example, multiple sclerosis is a good example of that. There have been quite a few clinical trials looking at CBD in multiple sclerosis, and they've shown that it doesn't really change muscle tone or actual spasticity. But if you ask the patients if they feel better and if their spasms are better, they say there is a difference. So, I mean, in some ways, maybe we're getting into like placebo effect here, or potentially maybe it's just making them less anxious, and that makes them notice their symptoms less. But yeah, so there's the chance there could be a meaningful intervention, even though that we're not seeing a quote unquote cure.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, what the real issue is when you try to convince someone that this is going to cure their disease, right? So many people are looking for, a solution to their medical problem, right? They're on a diagnostic odyssey, let's say. What are we going to do? What's the solution? And so that kind of just playing on that fear, as Matt was talking about, is a real issue. But I think, doing podcasts like this, or putting out information that kind of really highlights the benefits as well as areas where CBD is not beneficial, is really kind of that first step in kind of cutting through all of the noise that we see out there around CBD and cannabinoids in general.
And it's really important to note that when we're saying these trials don't work for UC or Crohn's and things, or cancer, the absence of proof of a clinical effect isn't the proof of absence of a clinical effect. So sure, they may be found to work in the future. They may be really helpful in the future. And we're going to do some other podcasts about things we do think there are benefits for. I mean, we take CBD. We clearly think that the benefits outweigh the risk, but we have to start from a place of intellectual honesty and talk about the data as it is, and not make claims that it can do things or cure things that haven't been proven. Even if maybe there's a hint of it in the future, if it hasn't been proven, we can't say that. We can't give people false hope. And we've been talking for almost an hour now, so I think that's probably a good stopping place. But I think, Taylor, we would love to have you back. I've just had an incredibly fun time picking your brain, because Mike and I, we can read this primary research, but we're not in the lab where you are looking at this and have the deep knowledge that you do. So we'd love to have you back sometime to talk about some of the things that you think you really can use CBD for.
Yeah, certainly. Always happy to chat about CBD.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks a lot.
We hope you like listening to the podcast as much as we like making it. If you think it's valuable, share it with somebody. Send to someone you think would really benefit, and leave us a 5-star review in iTunes. Those reviews really, really help us out. Find us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram at WildHealthMD. If you didn't like, well, why are you still listening? Email us and let us know what we can do better. But the best way you can thank us for our time is to leave a review and share. Until next time.